So yes, my name is Daniel Jones. I'm CTO of Engineer Better. We help people deliver value more quickly, in a nutshell. There are two caveats, two things I need to let you know about today. One is that I developed both a cough and a sore throat yesterday. So apologies about that, and I'll try not to do a Theresa May on you when I'm giving this talk. The second thing is that if you saw a talk called Anthropic Sympathy from me at Cloud Foundry Summit, you will have seen this before. It was a daft title, no one understood what it meant, so I've changed the title of the talk. So if you've already seen that and you would get more value by going seeing another talk, feel free to leave, I'm not going to be offended. Okay? So, last summer, there was a really interesting article published by BBC News, and it was all about the lag in expected productivity gains from electrification of factories. So in around about the 1880s, electric generators and electric motors became available. But it wasn't until the 1920s that they actually had any measurable impact in terms of the productivity of factories. So in this picture, we can see a cotton mill. And the layout of these factories was dictated by the steam engines that were powering them. You can see up at the top these long crankshafts that were transmitting the power from these steam engines through to the machines. And the layout of these factories, the shape of the buildings, the shape of the rooms was dictated by these crankshafts. And so the location of the machines was dictated by these crankshafts and by the use of steam engines. And that meant that the way people were working was dictated by the use of steam engines. So if people wanted to use new electrical motors and electrical generators, it meant changing everything about how they were working. And that's why it took so long to get the productivity gains. These days, we're not constrained by steam engines. Although, having worked with a few enterprise databases, I do wonder sometimes whether they may be steam powered. But instead, we're constrained by what I call digital paperwork factories. The enterprises with the billions, the incumbent enterprises, made their money in the post-war era of mass production, where making 1 million identical widgets was the way forward, a world of certainty. Build it and we'll be able to sell it. And the processes and the org charts and the policies came out of that era. So, and in that era, doing things cheaply, the same thing 1 million times cheaply, was more important than being able to do new things quickly, as we have to do in the current age. So this talk is all about some findings from cognitive psychology and neurobiology that support the case for continuous delivery being a better way of doing things, and why a lot of these practices that we've inherited from digital paperwork factories, where we've copied what worked in mass production after the Second World War, and then we've made a bureaucratic paper process, and then we've made a SharePoint-based version of that same process, and now we're trying to make software as if we're making widgets, why those practices are harmful. So you're probably all familiar with something that looks a little bit like this. An enterprise cut into silos. If you need to deliver any business value, you're going to need all of those silos to collaborate. You're going to need to coordinate with all of them because they're all on the critical path to value delivery. In organizations like this, it often feels the people inside each silo, like the people in other silos, don't care about their problems and they're apathetic. But why? They're all part of the same enterprise. They all work together. They've all got the same A1 poster of corporate values on the side of their cubicle. Surely they were all working together. Is there something to this sense of apathy? Is there a reason for that? It turns out there might be. This is a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner. It's used to measure levels of activity in different parts of the brain over time. One of these was used in a study performed by Professor David Eagleman a number of years ago, where a control group of subjects was placed into the scanner. They were then shown different videos, either of a hand being gently dabbed with a cotton wool bud, or being painfully stabbed with a syringe. Baseline levels of activity in areas of the brain associated with feeling pain and with feeling empathy, with being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, were measured. So that was the control group of subjects. They then repeated the experiment. This time, they asked the next group of subjects to identify their religious beliefs before entering the scanner. So, are you a Jew? Are you a Muslim? Are you an atheist? Are you a Sikh? This time, when the videos were displayed, the religious identity of the person being hurt was also visible on screen. What did they find? When the identity of the observer was the same as the person being hurt, there was a larger empathic response. When the identity of the person being hurt differed, there was a smaller empathic response from the observer, smaller than when there had been no labels in the first place. This showed that people care less about outgroups. As soon as you start carving people up from self and other, you start caring less about their problems. You start to lose the ability to put yourself in their shoes when you consider them other. So if we go back to our silos, well, it's no wonder these people feel like the other people in other silos don't care about them. For a start, they're in silos, right? They're not actually working together. They're not going to see each other's problems. But the fact that they've got different identities and they're cut up into my team and your team, my tribe and your tribe, means that we're going to be less able to empathise with their problems even when we do see them. But thankfully, this is where continuous delivery can help us. Continuous delivery requires a level of automation that allows us a smaller problem space. We don't need such broad and deep knowledge in so many different areas because so many things on the critical path to value have been automated away. So what do I mean by a problem space? Well, if these are all of the different all the teams that we have, then the problem space of all of the different areas that we need to care about looks like this. But if we're continuously delivering, we can't have these folks on the critical path to delivery. That would be far too slow. So these tend to get automated away by platforms. Even things like databases. A good platform really should require that you don't need to know how to stand up the database and maintain it. You just need to know how to consume it. So what you end up with is something that's a fraction of the size of the problem space that you had before. You don't need such specialisms. And because you don't need such specialisms, instead you can focus all of your efforts into one cross-functional product team with a shared identity. All of these people are working on the same problems, they've got the same identity, and they care about each other's issues. If we co-locate them, it turns out we can get some extra productivity benefits as well. A trio of Norwegian and Italian scientists looked to explore the correlation between productivity and human capital, so the education and experience of people working in a number of different consultancies. They also looked to explore the correlation between productivity and social capital, so social capital being how often people communicate and with how many other people they communicate. In all three cases, social capital correlated positively with productivity. Interestingly, in 2 out of 3 cases, the human capital, so the education and experience of people in those consultancies, did not correlate with productivity at all. So looking at the sociability aspect, this makes perfect sense if you consider your enterprise like a network. If this is the phone network and there are only 2 phones and 1 connection between them, it's a low value network. It's not going to be very productive, right? There's only so much work that this thing can do. But if you add more nodes and more connections between them, you end up with a more valuable and productive network. Continuing with the metaphor of telephones, we can make this network more productive by making the communications between those nodes more reliable, making it more likely that communications are going to be understood and their original intent communicated effectively. And with humans, we can do this with some quite cool abilities of the human brain. So, watching that video, I was trying to look out over the audience. You may have felt a slight raising of your own eyebrows, a slight widening of your eyelids, and if in a micro expression. And if you did, that could have been because of mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are brain cells that display a particular type of behaviour. They fire both when an action is performed and when an action is perceived. Now, they're not a type of brain cell, so you can't look for the shape of them and go, oh, that's a mirror neuron. It's a behaviour that they exhibit. And that means that it's very hard to prove their existence in the human brain. It involves invasive surgery that not many people are volunteering for. So instead we talk about the mirror system. And in order to infer the existence of the mirror system, there's something called the mirror hypothesis. And the mirror hypothesis goes like this. When you see someone else's facial expression, your mirror system fires, sending signals to your facial muscles, causing you to mimic, in a micro expression, their expression. That then, through something called embodied cognition, your physiological state is assimilated into the orbitofrontal cortex of the brain. This is what gut feeling is. It helps tip the balance of your decision making. And so when you see someone smiling, it's not just that you go, right, I know as a fact that humans smile when they're happy. You're actually putting yourself in the same physiological state as them to gain extra insight into their state of emotional being. And there's some really cool evidence for this. So another experiment was performed where a control group of subjects was asked to identify emotions being expressed in photographs of people's faces. So that gave us a baseline level of ability to identify emotions in photographs. The experiment was then repeated with a different group of subjects, this time who were Botox users. Now, for those of you not into your cosmetic surgery, Botox is a lethal neurotoxin, which in teeny tiny amounts is just enough to paralyze facial muscles. On average, Botox users were less able to correctly identify emotions being expressed in these photographs. Now, I'm not saying that Botox users are narcissistic, emotionally dead sociopaths. I'm definitely not saying that. And that's not what the research said either. Instead, the conclusion was that this chain of the mirror system was broken. They were seeing the same faces, the mirror system was firing the same, sending the same signals to the facial muscles, which then weren't responding, denying their brains this physiological input from the state of their bodies, making them less able to correctly identify those emotions. So if we add that all together, we got human contact. We can co-locate a team. We're going to get face-to-face contact and communication. There are other things, like there's a great story about blushing I can tell you about afterwards that works in a similar way. That makes people more able to empathize. You're more able to understand people's emotional intent. Empathy is the lubricant for sociability. If you understand where someone's coming from, it's more easy to understand their intent and what they're trying to communicate with you. That makes you more sociable. And sociability is positively correlated with productivity. So we all know that narrowband communications suck, right? Otherwise we wouldn't have emojis. I have 2 young daughters, and I would much rather live in a world without emojis, okay? But when you instant message people, do you realize that you're giving up these kind of abilities, that you're missing out on all these extra ways of inferring people's state and intention? So let's go back to our product team. They're face-to-face now. They've got a shared identity. They understand each other's problems, and they're communicating quickly and effectively. But in the old world, it didn't look like that. Instead, communication was slow, often asynchronous. In order to get any business value delivered, you needed to coordinate these teams' time. You needed to get all of them on board, all in a line. That meant there was a high transaction cost to doing anything because of the amount of coordination and how slow it was. And this has negative consequences. If it takes like 6 weeks to get 1 week's time from the test team, you're going to bunch up all of your features. And you end up with a Gantt chart that looks a little bit like this. Where instead of working on one feature at a time, we ask silos to work on a bunch of stuff and do all the testing for all of this quarter's features all at once. And in situations like this, something like load testing tends to happen at the end. And in situations like this, something like load testing, which happens at the end, often tends to fail. But why? We're doing waterfall here. We have a very clear requirements document that in chapter 13b says that we must be able to sustain 1,000 requests a second. Didn't you read the requirements document? It was very clear. Stuff failing at the end of long projects could well be down to the present bias, which is a well-observed psychological phenomenon that shows that humans value things more highly when they're close to them in terms of both time and space, and the further away something is, the more its value gets discounted. That's why buy now, pay later sofas are still a thing, right? Because that value is discounted the further off in time it is. Now, I mentioned this is a well-observed phenomenon. It's been documented since the 50s, so it's not really news, right? But what is interesting is that it appears to have a biological underpinning. A bunch of rhesus monkeys were given a choice between a little bit of sugar water now or a slightly bigger bit of sugar water in a few seconds' time. And by varying the amount of the second drop and the amount they'd have to wait, scientists were able to map out their observed preferences. So like, how much more sugar water do I need to offer a rhesus monkey to make it worth the monkey waiting another 5 seconds? So they performed this experiment, plotted out how monkeys made that decision. They then inserted electrodes into these lucky monkeys' brains, into their intraparietal area, observing the firing rate of specific neurons that appeared to be encoding the value in this decision-making process. So the faster the neurons are firing, the more valuable the choice. The slower they're popping, the less valuable the choice. Turns out there was a near one-to-one mapping between the two. The red line there is the observed behaviour, and the black line is the firing rate of these neurons. It is really unusual to find something with such a clear explanation in the field of neuroscience. The brain is a fantastically complex organ, full of competing complex adaptive systems which are in tension with each other. This is really unusual. But if the present bias has a neurological underpinning, it means it's unavoidable. We can't escape it. Sure, we can rationalise it. Sure, we can try and keep it in mind, and we can try and work around it and be self-aware. That requires self-control, which, as we'll see later, is a limited resource. If the present bias is unavoidable, we're never going to get away from it. So how can we exploit it instead of falling victim to it? So yeah, our load testing was off 3 months in the future. That's a long way away from my concerns now. I've got a manager barking about deadlines to me, about my work that I'm doing here and now. That's some other team. The testers will discover that 3 months' time. I don't care about that. But in a continuous delivery world, we already moved these folks off the critical path to value delivery. So we're left with a much smaller set of concerns. And really, we shouldn't be doing development and testing separately, not in 2018. We should be doing test-driven development. And we should be doing that in one self-sufficient, cross-functional team. If that team has self-service over their environments, over their deployments, they can do all the things they need to do when they need to do them, then it doesn't make sense to be working on multiple features at once. Instead, it makes sense to be working on one feature at a time. And that's important because it makes everything that that feature requires important in the here and now. Not in 3 months' time. Today, maybe tomorrow at a push. All of the things are important now. Having self-service allows us to exploit the present bias rather than falling victim to it. That allows us to make everything important now and exploit our biology. Continuous delivery can also help us address technical debt. I'm going to highlight 2 different ways, one less obvious than the other. In 2013, Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir performed some research where they were looking into the psychological effects of being made aware that you don't have enough of something that's important to you. And in an exemplary piece of research, they posed shoppers in a New Jersey mall a hypothetical question. You've been involved in a car accident. Your insurer is not going to pay for the costs of repair to your car. How are you going to find the money to get your car back on the road? And respondents were split into different categories according to their income, either rich or poor. Now, each person was only asked the question once, but they were asked to cover a different amount, either $300 or $3,000. So they posed this hypothetical question, how are you going to find the money? And immediately afterwards, they're given a fluid intelligence test. This is Raven's progressive matrices. The objective is to spot the next one in the pattern. It's not without its critics, but it's often used as a proxy for IQ. For the rich people, it did not matter whether they were asked to find $300 or $3,000. Their score was about where you would expect it to be, controlling for demographic. For the less well-off people who were asked to find $300, their score was about where you'd expect it to be, controlling for demographic. But for the poor people who were asked to find $3,000, their effective IQ dropped by 13 to 14 points, just by being reminded that they didn't have enough of something in their real life by hypothetical exercise. So, fascinated by this, the researchers went on to go and look at all different types of scarcity in all different populations around the world. And they were particularly interested in executive control. And they used something called a Stroop Test to try and identify effects on executive control. So you've probably seen one of these before. You're supposed to say the word that's printed rather than the colour it's printed in. That exercises the premedial frontal cortex, which is responsible for executive control, and you have to inhibit answers from different parts of your brain machinery. That's what self-control is. Like, you've got different bits of your brain suggesting answers, and you have to quieten down some of them. So Stroop Test was used in a number of the studies, and time again, it was demonstrated that scarcity reduces people's self-control and also impacts their ability to remember to do stuff in the future. But scarcity can't just be, can be caused by other things than money. Social contact was another factor. Not having enough social contact, being lonely, triggered the scarcity effect. But interestingly for us, the scarcity effect can also be triggered by time. Now, you have to think about what happens in your engineers' heads every time you remind them, time's getting on, you've committed to get that done by the end of the sprint, and you don't want it to slip into Monday because I'm going to have to replan next week's sprint, and the Scrum Master's not going to be happy. Every time you are pestering people about deadlines, you are reducing engineers' effective IQ, making them less able to solve abstract problems, which, last time I checked, that's what we hired engineers for, solving abstract problems. But even better than that, we're reducing their self-control. So they're going to be more likely to cut corners and incur technical debt to meet your deadline. And to top it all off, right, we're inhibiting their prospective memory. They're making them less able to remember that they need to patch the corners that they cut to meet your deadline. If you're doing waterfall, then okay, maybe this happens once every 3 months, and it's not so bad. Maybe that the effect is negligible over a long time frame. If you're doing Scrum and you're making commitments every 2 weeks, then you're enforcing this scarcity mindset on people every 2 weeks. And why? Seriously, why? Yes, boss, I will get the work done, boss. You can trust us, boss. We will do the work. We're not going to slack off because we've told you we're going to get it done by the end of 2 weeks, boss. Honest, boss. There's a better way of working than that. Continuous delivery makes deadlines meaningless when done properly. We don't need to make commitments. Right? If you want to know how fast one of our teams goes, go look in production. Go look at the things that we've got into the hands of users in the last 2 weeks. Go look at the things that are generating business value, that are generating data, that we've deployed. Look at our past performance. Don't ask me to predict what I might get done in 2 weeks' time. I'm not a clairvoyant. I can't tell the future. If I could, then I'd be out buying lottery tickets, not practicing Scrum. Because we're continuously delivering, we've got a repeatable track record that people can make estimates from, rather than asking us to predict the future. And because we've got self-service and we don't have so many silos to coordinate, we don't have knock-on slips affecting stuff. The work will get done when the work gets done. But we can combine this with two simple but really powerful ideas. We should be continuously delivering the most important thing. So if we go back to our project plan, no one's going to win any Microsoft Projects awards for Gantt charts with something like that, are they? One single bar. So with the power of Keynote animation, we rotate it 90 degrees, and lo and behold, we get an order backlog. Prioritized by importance by the stakeholders, by the business. When we pick a feature up, we pick up the top feature. Not the one I like doing, not the one I think I'm best at. I'll do what's at the top, regardless of whether I think I'm best qualified for it. That's how I get better. That means that we're always doing the most important thing, and we're never goofing off. We're not skipping to what we think is important. We're always doing what our stakeholders think is the most important thing. And if we always continuously deliver the most important thing in the simplest way, then we're not over-engineering anything. If you tell us that you've got a requirement to cut stuff, we're not going to build you one of these. We might make you one of these. If we're doing things in the simplest way, we can't make the task smaller. We've already trimmed all of the fat off of it. At which point we're taking the shortest route to that number one priority. We're not going on a meandering path, we're doing the bare minimum to get there. At which point sticking a date on a calendar becomes completely meaningless, right? It's a lot like shouting at the earth, asking it to go around the sun faster. Velocity is dependent on mass and kinetic energy. You can either reduce the mass, make the task smaller, increase the energy, add more resources up to a point. But do we have any physicists in the room? Like, dates don't appear in the equation for velocity. It's a completely unrelated concern. Continuously delivering the most important thing in the simplest way means that we make those deadlines meaningless. It will just get done when it gets done because we can't go any faster. We're affecting the only two variables that matter. Continuous delivery can help us with technical debt in another way too. You've probably heard at some point of a study that was performed in the 1970s looking at the outcome of US jail parole board hearings. And it was found that if you had your parole hearing at the end of the day, you stood a 20% chance of success. But if you had your hearing just after lunch, you stood a 65% chance of success. And for a long time, people thought that this was down to the parole board having lunch. Having eaten, having digested some glucose, metabolized it into lysine, which is used in the premedial frontal cortex, which, if you remember from earlier, is the bit that's responsible for executive control, in particular self-control and willpower. Turns out there's more to it than that. In a result that's been repeated a couple of times this decade, subjects were given an exhaustive Stroop test. So they're asked to do one of these things until they're reliably failing, so they're failing time after time. They're then asked to gargle one of two drinks, either a sugary drink or an artificially sweetened drink. So gargle it, spitting it out, and then immediately afterwards, gripping a hand grip exerciser as hard and as tight for as long as they possibly can to demonstrate their willpower. Who did better? People with a sugary drink or the artificially sweetened drink? People with the sugary drink. But why? Right? They're gargling it. So they're gargling it and they're spitting it straight back out. Even if they cheated and they swallowed some, there is no way they could have digested that glucose and it could have got round their body into their brain in a usable format by the time they were squeezing the hand grip exerciser. Instead, the conclusion was that glucose was binding to chemical receptors on the tongue, activating the brain's reward matrix. And it's that sense of reward that's replenishing willpower, not the glucose being metabolized. So if we think about continuous delivery, well, instead of us doing some work and then maybe 3 months later it getting into production when we're working on something else and we've completely forgotten about it, instead we're ticking features off on a daily basis, seeing stuff go into the hands of users, seeing it go into production, the state of the world changing. That's going to increase people's intrinsic motivation of seeing the effects of their work, and that sense of reward is going to increase their self-control, making them less likely to succumb to technical debt. So the automation that continuous delivery requires allows us a smaller problem space. We don't need such broad and deep knowledge in different areas. We can focus all of our efforts into a cross-functional product team with a shared identity where people are more likely to care about each other's problems. If we can co-locate those people, then we get to exploit human abilities to infer each other's emotional state and intentions. That will make them more sociable, and sociability is positively correlated with productivity. If our cross-functional team has self-service, then that makes feature-based workflows economical. That means we can work on one feature at a time. Everything that's important to that feature is important now, not in 3 months' time when I've discounted the value of it, because I can't escape the present bias. And if we're continuously delivering the most important thing in the simplest way, deadlines become meaningless. We can escape the tyranny of deadlines and the scarcity effect. We've already trimmed all the fat off the task. We've done the bare minimum for the most important thing. By continuously delivering these things into production, then we're increasing people's intrinsic motivation on doing the job and also increasing their sense of reward, increasing their self-control. So we're not constrained by steam engines, right? We're not constrained by the shape of our factories anymore. But we're also not in a world of certainty. We're not trying to make a million identical things. You make a million identical software classes, I am going to fire you. Like, you should have made a reusable component after the third time, if that. This is not the world we live in. But we are constrained by the thinking of incumbent enterprises and the policies, the processes, the org charts that were geared up for this era of mass production after the Second World War. That's not what we're trying to do anymore. When Dan and I founded Engineer Better, we spent some time trying to work out what beliefs we had in common, what philosophically we shared ground on. And one of our observations was that businesses are only made out of two things: hard-earned money of shareholders and easily spent, read easily wasted, time of employees. Now, it's kind of easy to be glib about the hard-earned money of shareholders, right, in a world that is massively unequal in terms of wealth distribution. But Sam Ramji, who was head of the Cloud Foundry Foundation, now works Google Cloud, pointed out to me a few years ago now that time isn't measured in seconds. Time is measured in heartbeats. You are all spending heartbeats listening to me talk right now. And I really hope that you're not going to ask for a refund, because you know what? Can't give it to you. We are all marching inevitably towards the end of our time on the planet. So this stuff is valuable. It's stuff you're not going to get back. You can't choose to spend it in another way. You've already spent it. But time is equal to money, as we know. Therefore, money is equal to heartbeats. So it makes no difference whether you're wasting the time of employees, asking them to follow some ridiculous labyrinthine enterprise process that you know to be inefficient, or whether you're wasting the budget of your employer. You are still wasting people's heartbeats. Somebody went out to exchange heartbeats for money doing a day's work, to save, to give to their kids, to invest in a pension, to buy stocks and shares in the enterprise that you know is doing a ridiculous, slow, inefficient thing because it hasn't changed to meet the new challenges of the world. And I don't know about you, but I can't get up in the morning knowing I'm contributing to that. It's one of the reasons why I started a consultancy to try doing something about it. Anne-Marie Neetham, COO of technology at Ocado, made a really good point, very succinctly, at a talk that I saw of hers a few months ago. Stop doing what you know to be wrong. I'm sure that a lot of us here know that continuous delivery is better, have felt that, have seen it working, and we know in some abstract, intangible way it's a better way of doing things. Hopefully this has given you some ammunition to go and fight that cause and to make some changes. If you go to engineerbetter.com/brain, you will find a very dry blog post article that talks about all of the research that I've mentioned here, plus a lot more about intrinsic motivation. All of the journals are linked to from there. Additionally, there's a write-up of this talk and a YouTube video of a previous rendition called Anthropic Sympathy you can find. And if you want to troll your resident Scrum Master, then there is some clickbait that I put on LinkedIn, which has done very well at attracting like 250 comments from people with Scrum in their job title about the commitments and deadlines thing. But that is me, so thank you very much.